In Chapter 12, we will be discussing the genre of music known as the concerto. Now, the classical concerto is an extension of the Baroque concerto, or the solo concerto, which was a very popular style of music. In the Baroque period, we also had the concerto grosso, but that became less popular and eventually fell into disuse. So when we say concerto in the classical period, or basically any time after 1750, the concerto grosso is no longer around, and any concerto is known as a solo concerto. In the classical period, violins and pianos were often used as the solo instruments. However, concertos for any instrument were composed and performed. And these concertos often followed the three-movement sonata plan that was explored in Chapter 11. Once again, a fast movement in sonata form, a slow movement, and then another fast movement. And each of these movements were designed to feature the soloist. Now, concertos were performed to highlight a soloist's talents, and they were written for only a few different reasons. Um, Oftentimes, composers would use a concerto to highlight their own abilities, to show off to people so that they would be hired to perform musical duties or to write more music for wealthy patrons. Or composers would write concertos on commission, already at the request of wealthy patrons to write music for them. On this slide, we discuss the end of a movement in a concerto, which usually ends with what is called a cadenza. Now, at the end of many of the movements, often the faster movements, the orchestra would stop and the soloist would play a section of music that would allow them to showcase their abilities. These sections of music, these solos, were often improvised and would be very flourishing, very fancy, very virtuosic to again show off the player's abilities. After the classical period, however, composers began writing their own cadenzas for soloists to play, and the improvisation part of that tradition um, dissipated. Mozart, however, was known to write out his own cadenzas for performers. Now, in a concerto, sonata form was still prominent, as with most classical music pieces. However, the sonata form was changed just a bit from an exposition to a double exposition. The difference between the exposition and the double exposition is that the two themes would be performed by the orchestra first in the exposition, and then the themes would be performed by the soloist. So after the statement of the two themes by the orchestra, you would then hear the statement of the two themes by the soloist. The development is similar to the development that we talked about in Chapter 11, where the themes would be manipulated. However, in some pieces of music, new themes would be introduced. The development would also often switch playing between the orchestra and the soloist. In the recapitulation, both themes would be restated as we talked about in Chapter 11. And this playing would often go back and forth between the soloist and the orchestra. However, after the statement of the themes, again, a cadenza would be presented to showcase the soloist, and then finally the piece would end with a coda. Our listening example for this chapter will be Piano Concerto number 23 in A major, and you will listen more to that and be guided through your various listening assignments regarding the classical sonata. That concludes chapter 12.